Welcome to a new episode of the Creative Industry Insight podcast. I'm your host, Bobby. Today, we welcome costume designer Carlos Rosario, who joins us to talk about his work on Shōgun. Carlos will talk us through the intricate detail of the costume designing process that him and his team went through. Please be warned about heavy spoilers in this episode. Now let's jump into the conversation with Carlos. Hi, Carlos. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
We're here to talk about Shōgun, which is streaming now on Hulu and Disney Plus. What can I say about the show? It's hitting that Game of Thrones sort of hole of shape in my heart right now, and yeah, I think yeah, I'm kind of I've run out of words of how to sort of describe the show and how many people to recommend it to and whatnot. But as someone who's worked on it, how have you found the reception of the show?
Oh, wow. Well, the reception has been amazing. I mean, the show is a huge hit everywhere in the world. The costumes have been very well received by everybody. So it's very exciting that we work so hard and then the result is, this incredible show, and with beautiful, stunning visuals. And, sometimes we work on really hard on projects and then, you look at the final product and you are just wondering why we had to, go through everything and how, and so this one, it was definitely all worth it. So it's a beautiful show and the reception has been amazing. And so I'm very excited about it.
Like you're mentioning about how much sort of work you and your team have gone through. I guess it's really hard to ever just like quantify like how special a show is until it comes out, right? Because you're making it and you're thinking, this is day, 86 of the shoot, but you don't know if it's going to be incredible or not. I know it's like very hard to sort of judge because you're doing it bit by bit, but it's always like the reaction of like the audiences and how they're going to take to a show as well. It's probably always a little bit nerve-wracking as well.
Yeah. Yeah, but when I was doing the show, I really never thought about I never really had I was never thinking about the magnitude of the project. I just was in the middle of it. I was in the middle of the tornado. It was all about doing my job as, beautifully as I could. I really started to notice that there was definitely a certain quality to this project that was very unusual based on all the other projects that I've worked on in the past, right? And so after the second episode, I was blown away by the sets. I was blown away by the hair and makeup. I was blown away by the locations, even by the acting, the photography. And so that's when I realized that this show was very unique and very special, But I think that at the end of the day, I don't really think about the final product because that's kind of, out of my hands. I really focus on, my work, my duty as a costume designer and just doing the best costumes I can. So it really is not about the magnitude of the show. It really is about, what I can bring to the show that is going to improve the quality of the project.
So with a project like Shogun where it is a period show and you're creating a lot of let me start again. With Shogun being a period show, where do you begin in your research and how do you start sort of breaking down what the characters are like and what they'll need in terms of costumes?
Mhm. Yeah, it's true. It's a good question because it's such a big show. Everybody always asks me, where do you start? Because it's true, there are so many characters. It's a complicated period too. There are so many costumes that need to be designed. And all these characters are also different circumstances, different locations. They are all of different ranks. So I think the first step was definitely to study this period as as much as possible. So we were in touch with an expert in the University of Kyoto, Frederick Cranes, and he's the one that really guided us from the beginning to the end. There were a lot of consultants on set, and obviously, the actors were Japanese and very knowledgeable in terms of this type of costumes. Frederick was mostly the person that really guided us throughout all the research. And so we started by studying this research, this period as much as possible. And the way we did that is mostly because we dissected the paintings of that period. To me, it was basically going straight to the essence of the Sengoku period. I didn't want to watch too many Japanese movies of, that portray that period because I felt it was sort of the interpretation of the director or the interpretation of the costume designer. And I didn't want to study that period through that filter. So we studied the paintings, the colors, the patterns on the paintings, and the placement also of the different characters, their hairstyles. And that really gave me some kind of guidance on, at least have a good first knowledge of what this period was about. And so that was the first big step towards creating a strong foundation, right? And so after that, it was really mostly about sort of understanding the different big categories of characters that were part of the show. So on one side, I had the nobles in Osaka, then the citizens in Osaka. I had all the armors, then I have the villagers in Ajiro, right? And so for each one of them, I created very specific color palettes, and that really helped me to kind of like create some kind of very strong container, very strong boundaries. So it would sort of eliminate right away a lot of possibilities. And that really helped me. And slowly, once I started with those big perspectives, those big concepts, then I started getting closer and closer to the characters and sort of go more into details, who they are, their ranks, things like that. That would really help me to identify who the character was. And that's when I started really introducing more of the emotional and psychological aspect to the costume, not just the historical aspect.
So I always like asking about the research part of a project just because it's always you get to see when guests tell me about who they used as references in terms of like a DOP might use photos, in your case, paintings. But also what I liked about the answer as well is the fact that you didn't want to watch sh films or shows set in those periods to sort of distort your idea of designing. It feels like you just leave yourself like a nice clean canvas of creating. And then also, as you said, it's like not necessarily authenticity, but it's the you could get your ideas could be slightly distorted because you might have seen a film from the 90s that's set in this point of time, and then there might be something that you like, oh, maybe we could use that, but then it doesn't work
Mhm.
for what you guys are looking for as well.
Totally, totally. Yes, yes. And I think, I mean, the good thing about Shogun is that the Sengoku period was sort of a period of transition. And so, in a way, the rules of the clothing of that period are not as strict as if it would be before that period or after. So that gave us a little bit of, flexibility. And also, James Clavell in the novel describe things in a way that are not necessarily accurate about that period. So that also allowed us to play outside of the boundaries of that period. And Justin Marks, our showrunner, always said that, we need to know about this period as much as we can. But then because of James Clavell taking some liberties about it, it really allowed us to be a little bit more creative than just if it would have been just a completely strict historical project.
I think that must have been like music to your ears a little bit as well. You're trying not to, we're not staying in one lane. We've got the whole highway. Let's go.
Yes.
But even so with that, like looking at paintings as well and the colors, because when you look at the show like this, what's very good in it in terms of the color palette wise is that people do not have like set color palette. So if it's a bad guy, for example, they'd always wear black in the
Hmm.
conventional sort of show, for example. But here you kind of mix the colors, and I
Hmm.
quite like the meeting when they have the meetings and they're all in their traditional dress, where they're going to be doing a vote for impeachment or if they're going to do something else. And I feel like you could tell that it's just really high quality costumes that they're wearing, that it's silk. The colors that they're wearing are very lavish for who they are. How do you go about choosing the color palettes for the characters? And as they are also of various statuses and rank in armies, how do you go about sort of implementing that look as well?
Mhm. So I think you said something that is very correct in terms of how I decided to design the costumes for this show, because I never saw it from the perspective of like good or bad, or, it just for me, it's such a mixture of so many different characters, and all of them feel so human to me in the sense that they are just so complex. They are multi-layered. And so I never really wanted to create through the costume something that was very obvious, you know. So I raised sort of that from my mind when I was designing every look. I think the way the color palette came about is because in the novel, the James Clavell novel, and then in the first script, the first thing that I noticed is that Ishido's army was described as the Gray Army, and then Toranaga's army as the Brown Army, right? And so that really was really actually the starting point of the design for the entire show in a way, because my sort of thought process was, well, if Ishido's army is gray by extension, his clothes should be gray. And same for Toranaga. I thought, well, if his army is brown, then by extension, his clothes should be in the browns, right? In the brown color palette. So I went in that direction. And so for Kiyama, I decided to go for red, for gray, Yabu for green, etc. Ona was purple. Every one of those lords had their color palette. And it really helped me tremendously because it narrowed down all my possibilities of choices. Like I said before, it was my way of creating very strong, specific containers through this color palette. So I could just, stay very focused about the type of costumes that I needed to design, within that category, right? So that was really important for me. And the interesting thing is that that wasn't accurate in terms of the period. But because James Clavell did it, we sort of wanted to pay homage to him and continue his vision. And so we went in that direction. And in a way, visually, I don't know if it really makes a big difference when you read the book, but when you actually see it, it really helps the audience to know who is part of which clan. And because there are so many different characters, I think it simplifies visually, the description of who is who.
Yes, and I think with like I guess if you did go for that conventional of like the good versus bad and the colors that are associated with them, it could be confusing as well. And as you said, with so many characters, it's like you want to make sure that even though they make up this one kingdom, you want to make sure that that audience members can see that they're part of this clan, they're part of that clan, and so on. And I guess that's very important. But then also when you're talking about the colors, when they say they're part of this grey army or part of this army, I guess like visually it can be grey's not really a great color visually, is it? It can be quite boring to put it in the nicest sense. But I guess when you have that grey and you have that sort of more freedom because of what the author of the book has done, it kind of makes it I bet you probably made it a lot more fun to be like, yeah, we're going to go with these greens, we're going to go with this yellow, all this red's really nice as well. Um,
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I took the concept and then I just run with it. For example, for me, Shido, his concept was, well, yes, it's true, you're right, gray is very boring. But in my mind, because I always felt that the Sengoku period was very organic, was very in connection with the earth, and I wanted a lot of texture and I wanted very natural elements, right? So, for example, for Ishido's army and Ishido, the concept was fire and ash. So, all the grays are to me symbolizes the ash, but then, there is always the touch of orange, which to me is the fire, right? So each one of the lords have their own concepts that are in connection with natural elements, and that really allowed me to play with very organic textural fabrics, and incorporating also very natural elements, like, for example, the black raven feathers on Yabu, Yabushige's Jimbauri or the peacock feathers on Toranaga's Jimbauri. It was my way to really create a difference between the Sengoku period and the Edo period later on. That is a period that is much more sort of luxurious and abundant and more modern in a way. It's more shiny. And I felt like this one needed to feel a little bit more raw and organic and textural.
There's also something that I'm curious to know about in terms of as a costume designer, because we see how a costume might sit on someone, but with a show like this where there's a lot of movement, there's also fighting. How do you go about designing the costumes that they're so that like an actor knows how to move them and operate in them? Just because uh, you as a designer, you don't have sort of live footage from that time period. Is there ways that you needed to sort of make doubles or costumes and make them sort of like cheat a little bit in the way they moved?
So I think that, I mean, except for the the battle scenes, we didn't really have to create multiples. I think it was mostly for the fights, the battle scenes for the samurais. Everybody had their multiples, yes. But otherwise, I mean, most of the fabrics are coming from Japan and they were coming in bolts of like 10, 11 meters. They're extremely unique and very expensive. And so we used every single inch of those fabrics, but there were only one of each. So, we used them carefully. We couldn't make any mistakes. And so we kept those, as strong statement pieces for my characters. Then when it was about creating multiples, I could play maybe with more sort of modern fabrics because I was able to find more yardage. I think the ones that really have more multiples are definitely the samurais. So we had, I think Mr. Sanada had maybe three armors in total. And so I decided actually for his armor and most of the armors, I mean, I made them in leather because I thought that leather would make them much lighter, so would allow them to actually perform their stunts much easier. They're pretty heavy. Last time I dressed for the premiere of Shōgun, a mannequin with Toranaga's armor, I think there were about almost 40 different pieces. So it's multi-layered, and it's complicated to dress somebody in one of those armors. And yeah, it was, yeah, I think he had about two or three, I think three different armors. And so, those armors were pretty light because they were made out of leather. I didn't want to make them in iron, in metal, because that's usually what you see in Japanese movies. They're extremely heavy and they were more shiny too. And that's not what I wanted. To me, that represented more of the Edo period. Like I said before, I wanted something more raw, more organic, matte, and I felt that also leather broke down very well. So it would give, the fabric so much more texture and more depth and more life. And so I went for that. And yeah, so except for the, I mean, the samurais were mostly the ones that required multiples.
Basically, no pressure on your the people who did the cutters and the seamstresses and whatnot when it came to making them. No pressure on that. But I do like that because we are in a sort of way of like in a world where we could have so much images of how people move and how costumes should sit, that when you go so far back that you kind of have that idea of how you can play with it and then different materials that you can use. Like the leather, for example, using that to break down. I can imagine that like the actors once they found out it's probably leather rather than going for a steel armor, they probably just was like, "Phew, I'm not going to be walking around in this like
Well,
heavy."
they were so happy actually. Mr. Sanada told me that was the lightest armor he's ever worn in his career. So obviously he was very happy. They were all very happy because they had to wear those armors for hours and hours. And I mean, once you dress somebody with that costume, it's hard to take it off. I mean, like I said, there's almost like 40 different pieces. So it takes about two, three people to dress any of those samurais for about an hour. By the end, maybe we just, we made it happen in 40 minutes, but it was definitely a long process. So they were very happy that they were, that light.
Yeah, and once the showrunner or people on set, producers find out that you have to dress people, it takes more than an hour, then they
Yeah,
could, time is money, as they say. Um,
absolutely.
and they get worried. They're probably very happy once they found out you guys cut it down by 20 minutes.
Yeah. Well, the call times were still very early. I mean, it was always like 4 a.m., sometimes 2 a.m. So it was a long show, long days for sure.
Yeah, that's just mental. Honestly, that's just mental. But on top of like the principal cast, there's a lot of extras in the show, and I guess they might have been a little bit easier to design for because they're all of a certain ilk, in terms of where they are in the food chain and their status in the city or the village. But how did you go about creating those looks, but then also making sure that you had enough for when you had those big crowd days?
I treat everybody exactly the same way. I treat everybody the same way. I actually think that designing for background is actually, extremely exciting because that's when you really are creating really, very interesting characters. And when you design for the main cast, you really have to respect where they're coming from, and you really need to understand their emotional arc. The costume follows their emotional arc, their storyline throughout the 10 episodes. So there are a lot of things to take in consideration. When you design background, it's so much more exciting because you don't have those boundaries, right? And I like to treat the background, equally as equal with as much passion as the cast, because I really feel that it really tells the story. When you see background that is very well dressed, it really allows the audience to get into, in this case, the feudal Japan of this period, right? And so I think for us, we really we made a lot of the stock, a lot of the background costumes. We had a company in Thailand that provided us with made a lot of stock for the background, and then we made a lot of that those background costumes in Vancouver too. And then we broke down everything. Everything was overdyed. Everything was broken down. I also rented about 1,300 pieces from Japan because I really found there like really very interesting character pieces that were in very bad shape. And I thought, wow, those have been around for a long time, right? And so I was like, these are really incredible character pieces. So I mixed those with mine, and then everything was broken down and overdyed. And so that really, I felt that really helped the audience to immerse themselves into this period. So I really take everything, with much passion.
And as like a designer as well, like it's important that even though you do have those principal cast, it's the world around it that also is, as you were mentioning, immersing the audience into there. And I love when you're talking about the breakdown of the costumes that you've rented out from Japan and how you can incorporate them into the show. Just because, again, as audience members, like you think about how people are dressed, and it's like you have to understand this is going to be a robe that somebody's probably worn, every day for the past year, or they change it every few weeks or something. So they need you kind of
Yeah,
want to have that feel of like crispiness on it.
absolutely. I think there is nothing worse than watching a show, for example, like this one, and just realizing that the costumes haven't been broken down, that they've been washed the day before, that they just came out of the workroom. You need to understand that these are real people. You're trying to convey a story to the audience. And the way to do that is by creating real characters that really existed, and you need to dress them in a way that is so accurate that it feels real, that the audience can connect with them, right? But also, one thing that I wanted to say that is important is that your main cast exists because of the background. The background is the container for your main cast to be relevant, right? And so I see it always as sort of an extension of the cast. If the background is very nicely dressed, then the cast will always stand out. They will be more credible, right? And more relevant. So I always see it as equally as important as designing for the cast. And also we took it very literal, like very we did a lot of research about, for example, the peasants of that period. And so, we created specific pieces that they would create themselves at that moment. And some of those pieces were handmade, right? It was a combination of different fabrics that they would sort of stitch together, right? In a way to create thicker sort of coats, right? And so that was a way for them to protect themselves from the winter, from the harsh conditions. So all those pieces were sort of done by hand. And that really told the story. It tells the story, it makes the show much more realistic.
And I think it's those little details, as you're saying as well, as like the having those sporting cast actors being there as like place for the actors to shine and really kind of be in that lived in world. Because it's like, don't get me wrong, actors are great and it's important to have them on the forefront, but it's like everything that's been created around to create for the show and like creating that authenticity of it all is like the most important thing. And I think
Mhm.
that's I'm really glad that I asked the question about the dressing of the supporting artists because it's so I can just hear your passion about it and how like actually it's very interesting how important it is and it's how it like it's very something that's very easily overlooked, but it's there to be and you and your team have put that effort in and made sure that it looks perfect in from the research period to what's being rented in Japan and what's also being created so that nothing looks out of shape on the show.
Yeah, and also I think that, in this specific period and in this specific case, I felt like the costumes really, really told the story of who the characters are, probably more than on in other circumstances, right? Because, for example, even though the silhouettes of the Japanese clothing of that period are very simple, it's very complex. And we needed to understand all the different details that made the difference between the people from different ranks. So, for example, the female characters have all different types of numbers of layers, right? The Zoris for Lady Ochiba are higher because she's of a higher rank, right? We made cotton tabbies for Lady Ochiba, the Daioin, the Yaechio, and the Taiko because cotton was very rare at that moment. So they are only the only ones that wear cotton tabbies, right? The number of pleats also determined your rank, how wealthy you were. The number of layers also for the male characters. So we needed to understand the language of the clothing of that period because every single detail meant something. And in that case, by respecting that, I felt that I was respecting the Japanese culture, the Japanese aesthetic, but also it would help me create my characters.
And I think that is the most perfect few sentences to end the episode. Carlos, thank you so much for your time. Shōgun is streaming now on Hulu and Disney Plus. Go out and watch Carlos and his team's work. Just get blown away by his detail, the costumes, and all their hard work that they put in it. Thank you again, Carlos. Thank you.
So thank you to you. Thank you.
You take care and bye bye.
Okay, bye.
Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast.